today. I have been asked to talk about the socio-economic theme, which is the proposed theme for this refresher course. So I have prepared a PPT, which I will be sharing with you right now. Give me a moment.
Yes.
Okay, so I think the PPT is visible in full scale.
Yeah, yes, visible. Very nice.
Yes,
Thank
madam,
you.
visible.
Okay. I do have some network issues. So if the PPT gets stuck in between, kindly have patience with me. So today my topic, which I will be talking with the participants of the refresher course, is the memorial stone tradition in socio-economic context. I had an opportunity to work on the memorial stones in 2020-22 as part of one of my ICHR project. Okay, so most of the data which I have taken for this presentation is coming from that project report. So with that introduction, let me directly come to the point. So most of those people who are part of this group, they're already familiar with the idea of memorial stones. But just to give a general introduction, the memorial stones which I have referred here are related to hero stones, Virgalu, Veer Mastigalu. Okay, so there are different categories which we will be discussing in the forthcoming PPTs. So if we look at the introduction of the topic, the tradition of erecting memorial stones for fallen men or women and sometimes animals also can be seen across various cultures in the world across space and time. These memorial stones do not simply recognize the hero, but they also sometimes tend to glorify and magnify them and gives a kind of authority and meaning to their actions and their sacrifice. And some of this element has become the part of ritual fabric as well as folk tradition of modern day society also. So memorial stones commemorated different types of so-called noble behavior or valor act or act of heroism in ancient India, and such as death in the battle, fight with enemies, protecting women, or protecting animals, protecting property, protecting land of the village, and so forth and so forth. So the memorial stones are a very interesting example of understanding the subaltern socio-economic tradition of a particular region. And luckily, South India, especially Karnataka, Andhra, Tamil Nadu, they are rich in these memorial stones. I think Karnataka has one of the highest numbers of memorial stones at present in India. Okay. So when we look at memorial stones, we can understand the concept of these stones, that the memorial stones reflect an important aspect of human behavior. And it is something which is not a new idea or something which suddenly started. We can trace its roots up to from the prehistoric time onwards. And here, when the artist, if there is an inscription, well and good. If there is no inscription also on the hero stones or memorial stones, the memorial stones have certain kind of images, visuals, which talk about the creativity of that certain population and what kind of idea they were trying to display through those images or visuals, and what kind of memories they were trying to represent in front of the population and the family members who had created that memorial. So this represents a very strong interrelation between the individual who has passed away and his family, the society, and later period, the territories and the memories related to his action. In this context, some scholars have done great work on memorial stones, including Professor S. Shettar. So Shettar talks about this origin of memorial stones. So he says that logically, when we look at memorial stones, it was a tradition which can be traced back as early as the megalithic or even before that period when the menhirs were erected. Those who are familiar with menhirs, well and good. Those who don't know menhirs are like big stones or stone slabs which are erected. It's a unique feature of megalithic traditions of South India, but menhirs are also seen in Europe Okay, so Shetta tries to trace the origin or the beginning of this memorial stone tradition with a background of menhirs coming from megaliths, and he calls them as a prototype of this memorial tradition. And we start from uninscribed memorial tablets, move towards inscribed memorial tablets, and then finally we reach where inscription and images everything come together. Okay, but the problem which we see today is that a lot of stones which we come across, they are not inscribed. So assigning a fixed chronology or accurate dates to these memorial stones has always been a problematic subject. Okay, so when we look at the features or main characteristics of these memorial stones, one thing is very clear that the artist who was trying to represent it, they are looking at the depiction of figurative art. Whatever icons are displayed or images are displayed, they're in a very figurative form, very direct graphic description they have tried to present. So the figurative art seen on the memorial stones are represented and they can be considered as the simplest methods of communication and memorization for the people who erected it. The people or the family members who made this memorial stone, they wanted to remember the person and they wanted to communicate his achievement or his sacrifice for eternity. Okay, and that the purpose was basically not only for a family. They don't want to limit the memory only to the family, but they were sharing or publicizing it to a much bigger scale, can be assumed by the location of these memorial stones. These memorial stones were not in private spaces, but they were always located in more public and open spaces. So the choice of location of these stones was always a public space of very high visibility where people can see it, such as along the boundaries or on the corners of the agricultural fields, on the banks of water bodies like rivers, tanks, wells, and inside the temple complexes, wherever temple complexes will be there, so along the boundary wall or within the complex, these stones were erected. So it wanted to make sure that people see it, people remember it, and people value it. So this shows a very clear interrelation between the site selected for the erection of the memorial stone, as well as the routes of communication which were utilized by people in that particular period. So unlike historical narratives, what we see in the literary text or any other archaeological uh, inscribed informations, there is no sense of era or time period or event or chronology in these narratives. Only based on style or aesthetic sense, we can guess the chronology of these memorial stones. So what kind of information we get from these memorial stones, which we can understand from social as well as economic perspective. So as I said in the earlier part, that most of the hero stones are not inscribed. They don't have any inscriptions. And if they are inscribed, in the beginning, we have examples of very long, multi-line inscriptions, but later they become very small, 2 lines, 3 lines, something like that. And if they are inscriptions, they're mostly commemorative to the point. And the historians understand the uninscribed, just plain hero stones based on the local oral traditions which is existing in the area, that is focusing on ethnoarchaeology and ethnography, and the artistic quality of the stone in general, that how it looks. So on that basis, we can guess who must have created it and who was the hero. Okay, but if it is inscribed, we get plenty of information, at least the name of the hero, why he died, maybe who made that, who erected that stone, okay, and what was the probable cause of his death. So the cause of the death is the interesting part, because most of the hero stones usually represent the actual incident which caused the death of the hero. Okay, so if it is a very detailed inscribed hero stone, we get all these things, the people who erected, plus the genealogy of the king of that particular period. So it gives a political history also of that particular timeline. Okay. But also the interesting part which comes is the grants which are mentioned. Some of the hero stones which have inscriptions, they mention grants, land grants, or any other kinds of awards which were given to the family member of the hero who had passed away. So this grant part of the inscription adds an economic context to this memorial practice. So when we look at the social themes, what kind of social themes are reflected in these memorial stones? So we will see some interesting contexts, like for example, Sati tradition and polygamy. Polygamy, Bahupatni Vivah, or something where the man had multiple wives. So these interesting features somehow appear in these hero stones. And Sati tradition is something which we see that it was already existing in the literature, but from 8th, 9th century and onwards, in South India, especially Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, we see this tradition entering in some random examples. But around 15th, 16th century, in Karnataka specifically, the number of hero stones bearing Sati stones also, that is called as composite type Veer Masti stone, that increases in numbers. The frequency of these stones increase in number. Okay, so to understand a social or economic history of any place, any region, we have to look at from different perspectives. So any analysis of social history which needs to place patriarchy in its historical context. Nothing that has emerged as a natural biological divide, but also to understand how the society was treating the women or the family and what were the different causes and effects of these traditions in long term. So in Karnataka, we call it as Sati tradition stones which are there, which bear Sati representation. Okay, it was called as Masti stone, Maha Sati stone, which in Upper or in vernacular becomes Masti. So we come across plenty of stones which only represents the female, that is a Sati. But we have an interesting composite stone, which is called as Veeramasti. That is, hero is there, and plus the Sati is also along with him. So it becomes a composite memorial stone where the hero is also remembered and the Sati event is also recorded. Okay. So one thing we have to understand is not all the women were committing sati. It is not a like it's not was a rule of the day that any man who dies, his wife has to commit sati. Okay, it was not a tradition. It was not a common occurrence, and some people were doing it. Some women of higher strata were started to do it, and somehow the lower strata in later period they started to imitate this act, either by family pressure or in some sense of religious or ritualistic fervor, or to bring the notion of honor to the families. So this trend increases in frequency by 16th century. Okay. So we see a lot of ideas in self-sacrificial memorial stones. I'm not talking about hero stone here. I'm talking about self-sacrifice stones, which is a type of hero tradition only, or memorial tradition only, where the so-called heroes, they were committing the act of, I will not use the word suicide because it has a negative notion, but it was like a sacrifice. They were taking their own lives as a part of a vow or as part of making a promise to protect their patron, either a king, queen, or a chief, or even as part of some religious act. So these self-sacrificial memorial stones also we find plenty in South India. And during the Hoysala period, around 11th, 12th century, some new, very aggressive such ideas developed through inscriptions, which are called as Velavali, Jolavali. Okay, so this is basically, it is like the people who took this oath, Velas or Jolas, who took the oath to commit self-sacrifice as part of their protection of the king. So if they fail to protect the king, they will kill themselves. Or if the king is defeated, they will kill themselves. And in return of this promise, when they used to take this oath, that they were granted some kind of land grant, or they were granted some kind of monetary awards for their family members as a kind of surety for their family's survival after their death. Okay, so a lot of articles have been written about this Veeravali tradition, which I'm not going to go in detail. So, and another interesting thing which we see into the uh, visual form of these memorial stones, how these memorial stones were created. It's not like all the memorial stones are in same design or same skill set. Memorial stones follow the basic idea. Some basic ideas are retained in most of the memorial stones, but the social and economic impact of the person who erected these stones are very clear based on just the visual aspects. Okay, so Fisher found a very strong positive correlation between level of social stratification and the art style. Because when we are talking about memorial stones, we are talking about art style because basically iconography is involved. So according to Fisher, artists of highly stratified society, where the society was into several groups, they used to produce very complex designs, crowded lot of information, lot of content in one single space. And sometimes they will be having less symmetry in their art. But when there was a society in which there was not much stratification, or not much hierarchy was involved, or people were in much similar levels of social status, we don't see this kind of variety. We saw very simple forms to be created. Okay, so this same idea we can observe in these memorial stones also. And when we look at the social themes, as I just talked about the concept of self-sacrifice. So these self-sacrifices, they were mostly influenced by the religious tradition of that area. And most of the hero stones bear some kind of religious symbolism. And most of the hero stones which we find in Karnataka, they somehow interconnect with Shaivism. The presence or the influence of Shaivism is clearly seen on these memorial stones. And as I talked about the idea of Sati stone, as I said in the beginning, that Sati stone was something which was not a common act, but somehow it started to get popularized through these stones. So the tradition of Sati seems to exist since the early historic period, and it was treated as a rule but exception. Not everybody was following it, as we see through the traditional literature of Mahabharata, Ramayana, Padma Purana, and Harshcharita. Harshcharita has a very interesting example. All of you are familiar with Harshcharita. Okay, so Harshcharita Banbhatta talks about the sati committed by Harshvardhana's mother. Okay, and the interesting thing is, usually when we say sati, the sati tradition, we simply assume that sati means the husband dies and the woman commits self-sacrifice on his funeral pyre. That is our understanding of sati. But in Harshcharita, the example is kind of different. He says that Harshvardhana's father, Prabhakar Vardhana, was seriously ill. He was ill. He was still alive. Okay, but Harshvardhana's mother, Yashodhara, she decided that she will kill herself as a married woman. So she took permission from her husband, convinced her family, that is, including Rajavardhana, and she committed sati when her husband was still alive. Okay, so this idea of sati has different nuance when we look at literature. But in later period, sati was something which always followed the husband after his death. So with the rise in political conflicts and socio-religious changes which are happening across India, this sati tradition became more and more glorified through text, through literature, through stories, and finally through the social practices post 6th century. Okay, so in Karnataka, one of the first examples which we see comes around 9th century AD from the literature, and then we see the numbers increasing slowly and slowly, gradually. The memorial stone commemorating the act of sati by the women reflected socio-cultural context of the early historic period, where this act had heroic, grand, moral connotation attached to it. And these women who were performing sati, they were given a title. They were called as Mahasati. Okay, and the stones which were erected in their memory, they were called as Mahasati Kallu. Kallu means stone in Kannada. So this sheer number of sati memorials in Karnataka testifies to the prevalence of the tradition in the region. Why we have so many numbers of the sati stones, including Tumkur, where I had done my project work. Plenty of hero stones which you see, they are not only hero stones; they are Veer Masti type, where sati has been there. Okay, so there is one epigraphical and literary evidence to show that these satis were worshipped during that time, and this worshipping has survived even in the present times. Interestingly, in modern times, when we see um, from ethnographical perspective, when we look at these sati stones, most of the sati stones which are there in rural populations or even in urban areas which have survived, they the people who the population who is around that memorial stone, they have forgotten what is these stones. Okay, most of them don't remember what are these stones. So these stones sometimes they remember, but if it happens to be Veeramasti stone, where the hero and the sati is represented, in many cases they worship these stones as Ram Sita. Okay, so that is a very unique thing where the worshipping has continued, but the identity has completely changed. So the hero and the sati have lost their identity, but the worshipping has continued by the local population, and they have been given a identity of gods. Okay, maybe a wrong identity, but still worshipping continues. So this is something which has been observed in several places during the time of field study. And this act, the Sati Act, which we see in literature, also has very graphic description coming from various sources, such as Ibn Battuta. Uh, he had come to coastal Karnataka around 13th, 14th century. So he says that he gives a very graphic description. He came across a sati procession where one woman was going to commit sati. Okay, so he graphically describes the whole mood of the procession, and he mentions that it is regarded as a commendable act, but it is not compulsory. Only when a widow burns herself, her family acquires a certain prestige by it and gets reputation for fidelity. So this is a very interesting thing which we see in later period also, that the women were committing sati or the act of sati. It was something which was more than sati. The family had prestige out of it. The family was getting a lot of favors out of it. Maybe it was a social favor, religious favor, or even uh, religious favor. Okay, so S.K. Iyengar, who has done inscriptions, South Indian inscriptions volumes, so he talks about that this sanction that technically religion, Shaivism or any religion, never had given any proper sanction to this act of self-immolation, that this sati. Okay, but has somehow maybe social and religious pressure was mounted on these women to commit this act. Okay, and one of the inscriptions which is very interesting, which comes from Mysore region, dated 1057 AD, it records the death of a female whose name is given as Dekambe, and her husband's name was Icha. So his husband, during a wrestling bout, he killed his opponent, and the king got very angry by this, and he punished Echa by death punishment. And so this was a punishment. The person died because of his act, and the king punished him. So technically, he cannot be considered as a hero. But when we look at the inscription, the wife's family erected that memorial stone. So there, the wife promises to commit sati. Okay, and she says that this will bring fame for her family, her husband, and her husband's family. Okay, and in the inscriptions, a long inscription and genealogy, the Vamshavali of both sides, her family and the husband's family has been given, and she makes her family promise that there should be a gift of land, garden, and a temple should be created and worshipping should be done. So this is a unique example where the idea of hero is twisted, and the sati, the woman who is committing sati, she is putting conditions like, if I'm doing this act, what should be happening after this? Okay. So the Veeramasti stones also bring out the interesting examples of polygamy, because in all the hero stones, wherever the hero has been represented, the female consort will be next to him. But sometimes we see multiple women. Okay. So there will be two women. So that means maybe he had two wives and both of them committed sati. Okay. But sometimes it depends in representation also, that all the women represented are there his wife or they committed sati. So these examples, I will be showing some visuals in later slides. Okay, so here we have some examples. As I said, the act of hero, what we call as act of valor, act of bravery. Okay, so there are some examples I have shared with you. In the first picture which you see, it is a very simple hero stone. It's an inscribed hero stone. It's all these hero stones are presently in our university campus museum. So here what you see here basically is um, a hero who killed a tiger during hunting. His small dog is also represented in corner. Okay, so it's a very simple hero stone. Traditional hero stones, if you have seen, they are supposed to be divided into three panels. The lowest panel, the bottom panel, shows the incident which caused the death of the hero. The middle part shows the hero being taken to the heaven, and the uppermost part shows the hero in the vicinity of Shiva, that is in the form of Shivlinga or in the heaven. Okay, so this is something like that, but as you can see, the aesthetic part is not that fine. The aesthetic part is kind of crude. Okay, as I was just talking about the memorial stones, which talk about polygamy. So here we have one hero on his horse. We see two women and both have one hand raised. Okay, so their right hands are raised. So in traditional Veermasti tradition or Masti tradition, women raised hands shows that they have committed sati. Okay, raised hand means sati. This is example where actually anthropomorphic or female figure is shown. Sometimes in the simplest versions, there is no women body. Only one raised hand will be represented. Okay, and that is considered as a sati stone. Okay, so you can see one example. This is again, both are supposed to be Veer Masti. Okay, both are Veer Masti stones only. Okay, but you can see the quality of the aesthetic appearance. As I said in the beginning, that what you see, that comes from the artist who created it. An artist made what he was paid for, how much money he was getting to create. Okay, so if they are rich people, the families could afford good artist, good material, they were paying good amount, so they were able to create much better aesthetically looking beautiful stones. But if the artists were not that skilled, or if the family who was sponsoring the erection of the stone or the family members, they were not from that rich background, the result will be more simple, more plain, and more to the point. Okay, so these both stones represent Veeramasti, but you can see the difference. This present one, it is in Kuvempu University Shimoga Museum. So here again, as I just talked about, their hero and Sati are represented, but you can see the raised hand. One of the part of the art is the raised hand of the Sati. Okay, so the woman is somehow the lower part is missing, but the Sati hand is clearly visible. So this is something which we see not only in South India, but even in Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan also, this kind of raised hands stones are visible as Sati stones. Okay. Then another simple example you can see is here. This is again the hero, the woman behind him, and you can see the raised hand again indicating that she had committed sati. Okay, so why we have to think, because all these things are, most of these things are unscribed. So we have to just imagine, we have to just assume that why so much sati act of sati was happening during this period. What kind of social situations were there which were uh, forcing or which were motivating these women to commit sati. Okay. Now when we look at the simple and complicated versions, okay, as I said, these hero stones, even if they are not inscribed, both these stones, they are in our museum. The first stone is a little bit blur because the surface has eroded, but you can make out the figure of the horse and the rider with a dagger in his hand. Why I have taken these two stones? Because they represent the same theme. Horse rider, who are heroes, who have died, okay? But how we, because both of them are uninscribed, how we differentiate between their status, that who these heroes are, how we highlight that, okay, they don't belong to the same level. Everything else is same, what is different here? So as you can see the image, the only thing which makes us identify the status, higher status of one of them is the presence of this umbrella. Okay, so as you can clearly see, the hero is represented on the horse. Then behind him is a attender who is holding a shatra or umbrella behind his head. So wherever we have umbrellas, since the ancient period onwards, umbrella is a symbol of royalty, elite classes. Okay. So if you remember, even in case of gods also, umbrellas used to be represented. Okay. So wherever we see this presence of umbrellas, that indicates the hero was not a common soldier, but he was from the elite classes, probably a member of the royalty. Okay. So without an inscription, we are able to imagine or assume the status of the fallen hero. Now we come to the idea of grants, as we are talking about the economic aspect of these inscriptions, if inscriptions happen to be on the memorial stones. So several type of grants were made by the local corporate bodies, local chiefs, feudal chiefs or military chiefs, or village heads, sometimes rulers, and they ranged in varieties, different things were given. So maybe a small plot of land for the dependent or the family members of the hero, or sometimes much bigger, like full villages were donated, depending on the status of the hero. Okay, and based on the nature of his service to the patron. So this financial benefit, which was provided to the nearest family members of the fallen hero, was mostly compensatory in nature, as a kind of compensation. And Kukpuswamy, he has done his thesis on that, analyzed the economic factors governing the memorial stones in Karnataka by examining the purpose, content, and the procedure and proportion and value of grant which were made on such occasions. So if the chiefs or the village people were making some kind of grant to the family of the fallen hero, how it was, what was the nature of the grant and all those things. So the hero's family was also offered some kind of gift or economic relief, or sometimes some kind of symbolic gifts, giving them some kind of special privilege or maybe some kind of special status in the society. So we come across various terms in the inscriptions which identify these land grants known as Balagachu, Kalnadu, Shivane, Kodagi, Netravali, and Kodagi. Okay, so all these are different terms coming on different types of grants which were made. Okay. A number of records observed across South India mention about the grants made to the family of hero. In Karnataka, the inscriptions use the term as Balagalachu and Salagalachu. So land which was granted to military officials who were holding military ranks in the king's army for their distinguished bravery, act of bravery in the battles or their death in battles. That was called as Balagachu, okay, or sword washing grants. And they had to pay little tax on whatever grants they received under this category. If they had to pay any, sometimes the condition will be there tax free. If there was no condition of tax free, they had to pay small tax. Okay, the Kalna term usually represented land which was given to the family, but it was not for agriculture, it was cultivable land. Okay, so one inscription from Chittoor district of Bana period registers the grant of a plot of wetland of 5 kula, that is some kind of measurement, in sowing capacity by a king to a person on the occasion of a cattle raid. So purpose has been mentioned, what has been given, that has been mentioned, and location has been mentioned. Another undated inscription talks about from the same region that a family was given this much amount of land, this much measurement of land, when he died after slaying a number of men and horses. The Western Ganga inscriptions from different places, including Begur, talks about these grants as an act of bravery given to the soldiers' families. Okay. And the interesting thing is, not always the kings were making these grants, not always the military officials were making these grants. We see other people also who were not part of the king's uh, entourage, who were not part of king's administration routine or military background, who were making such kind of grants for the heroes. So one epigraph dated 1094 AD of Hoysala period from Ballari region talks about a group of Mahajanas, that is, who were part of the trading community, who were part of the financial part of the area. They were the ones who made a gift of land to the son of the man, that is Bashwanayaka, who had fallen when he died fighting against the thieves, a group of band of thieves. Okay, so who are these Mahajanas? They are basically the members of the local village council. So they came together, they had a discussion, and then decided to give some kind of compensation to the surviving family members of the fallen hero. Another inscription, which is dated 1249 AD from Bandipura, it mentions a grant of 500 pon to the family of the hero, and the family excavated a tank, created a flower garden, a resting place, and a hero stone in the memory of the fallen hero. And all this endowment detail, what else was added, has been mentioned in the inscription. The other inscriptions talk about that the grant was made by Samaya. So what is Samaya? Samaya is a term which was used for assembly, some kind of group of village members, village elders who made this decision to give a grant. Another one talk which comes here is when there was a fight, 300 men of the village came together and they granted Veera Seshe to the hero who died in a battle. So that means they are talking about village elders coming together to make this grant. So this gives an interesting social aspect where the grants are not made by people in authority of administration or military, but the common village administration also was coming forward to take a responsibility and to recognize the act of valor or the act of sacrifice made by the certain person, and what they were willing to act to give some kind of financial surety or safety to the remaining family members. Now, one interesting thing which I came across was the grants as inheritance. So, if the hero's family was giving the grant, was it permanent and for eternity, or were there some conditions attached? And if it was passable, or it could be passed to the next generations. Okay, so one inscription from Hassan district, which was around mid-10th century AD, it registers the donation of the village to a certain person who had taken the oath of Vele. Vele means who had promised to self-sacrifice or kill himself if the queen dies. So he committed that act after the death of queen. Okay, and then the inscription specifically says that the grant of the land which was made to him, the village was given as a land grant, and this grant was for perpetuity, that is forever. Okay, and it says that the royal and loyal tax officials, local and royal tax officials, should not enter the village. That means no tax has to be collected, and this tax-free grant that should be vested in the person who has received the grant and his successors. Okay, so it is a very interesting thing. A village has been given as a grant or as a donation to the person, and condition has been given that is a completely tax-free, and that benefit will be not only to the person who is recipient of the grant, but the next generations also will enjoy the same benefit. Okay, so we are looking at the inheritance nature of this kind of grants. A similar grant which we see from Chikmagalur area, it talks about that a group of Brahmins who decided to come together and made a decision. And when a hero died fighting a group of burglars, so they offered to give, and they gave a large palanquin, palaki, and a canopy to the family of this hero, the wife and the children, as a respect, as a object of respect, as a object of prestige. And they specifically says that it will go to children, like it will be inherited prestige or inheritance. The whole respectable act will not limit itself to the wife and child only, but it will move on to the next generation also. Similarly, another one inscription, it talks about permanent exemption from the house tax. That is the hero's family, after his death, they don't have to pay the house tax. Okay. And the one very interesting thing which comes is we are looking at the gender perspective. It talks about that is 1542 AD from Bhatkal area. It talks about the death of a army official, and after his death, as part of in the battlefield, so he was given a land, and that land boundary and everything else is mentioned. And it specifically adds in the last line that if the man has female descendants, women are there in the next generation, this should be given as a gift. And if they have male descendants, it will be given as right of succession, like inheritance. So in this gift, inheritance is mentioned, and they have kept in mind both options. If females are there, they will be receiving it as a gift. If a male are there in the next generation, they will be taking as right of succession. So this adds a very interesting gender perspective to the idea of grants associated with the memorial stones. Now, other aspect of socio-economic aspect when we look around is most of these acts of bravery, they relate to cattles, protection of cattles. Lot of the heroes who died, they died by protecting the cattles of the region. Okay, so the epigraphic reference to the cattle race, which is called as Thuragal in Karnataka, has given importance to this particular act of men who died while protecting the cattle. So what this indicates, why this is important? If cattle were given so much value that people are willing to die for it, that means that that particular area, it is not common everywhere, but certain areas, geographical areas only. It means that in that geographical region, pastoral economy, that is animal or cattle-based agricultural economy, was the most prevalent one. So this prevalent economy, which they had it, is basically focusing on the nature of economy of that area. That it was an agricultural, pastoral economy where the cattle happened to be the biggest asset. So people were willing to die for it, and people were willing to rob it from other villages. They were willing to steal it from other villages. Okay. So in this majority of the examples we come across in these hero stones, the cattle raids used to be limited to local territories, not long distance village fights. Nearby villages only were having this kind of disputes. In a record of 1195 AD, talks about the Brahmins, a group of Brahmins who presented a horse, a drum, and a rent-free estate to a man whose son had died while recovering the cows of these Brahmins from the bunch of robbers. And similar inscriptions talk about these kind of awards and other things. Okay. Another interesting thing which talks about is the role of shettis, the trading community, the merchants, who are also part of these cattle trades. So either they are doing the cattle trade, they are committing the act, criminal act, or they are the ones who are protecting it. So they are on both sides of the subject. Either they are robbing it or they are protecting it. Okay. So again, why? Because cattle was something which was very useful and important, and it was part of economic and social status. And this valuable economic asset of these cattle make or motivate the people willing to give their life and to protect the livestock and to protect their own property as such. And that's why, in turn, they were getting awarded for that. Now, looking at another nature of this is the artists, the artisans who are making these hero stones. So, as I said, most of these have no inscriptions. Some of the hero stones mention the names and and also the composer. If the inscription is there, it mentions the composer of the inscription also. And very few inscriptions talk about the name of the person who has made the engraving or who has carved the hero stone. Okay, so according to Shettar and Ganihar, the majority of the Hoysala artists were not keen on identifying their works by carving their names on them. Being of humble background and attainment, they were probably content to serve the local cause as sculptors whenever such occasions were taking place in their locality, and while preoccupied with one of their other occupations like hunting, agriculture, crafts, or serving in the army. And majority of these so-called artists were ignorant of the rudimentary knowledge, like they were not educated, they were not aware of the 3 R's, not to mention of any depth in letter and literature. So this is something very interesting, that the people who were creating these hero stones, who were these people? It was not a fixed profession that only these group of artists of stone masons or sculptors, they are going to create these hero stones. It was something which anybody who was a little bit skilled, they were doing it. It was like a side job for them. They were doing other things like agriculture, hunting, taking care of their cattle. And in between time, if there was an occasion like that, they would come forward and offer their service to create these stones. Okay. And looking at the inscriptions also, we can understand the people who were composing it or who were writing it, that was a different genre. They were different group of population. Most of the other people who artists who created these hero stones, they were not literate enough. They were not literate. So the only way to express themselves and express the feelings or ideas of the family was through the sculptures. So when we look at these artists' work, as I said in the very beginning, that the simplest form which we see of these hero stones has only one panel. There is like nothing, only one stone is there, and then you have the hero. That's it. No other things are there. Only the common thing will be on the edge of the stone, sun and moons will be represented. Okay, that shows that the memory of the hero or the act of the hero should be remembered for eternity. Okay. And the reason for such examples maybe is because the memorial stones were commissioned by those people or by those family members who had very limited economical resources as well as social standing. So they were able to afford that much only. So these simpler stones increase in frequency over time. Now this is interesting. Okay, we see very complex, large-scale hero stones starting from the Ganga period, that is Western Gangas, Hoysalas, Vijayanagara period. Very complicated three-panel stylized standard hero stones. But after the decline of Vijayanagara Empire, when Vijayanagara Empire breaks off, and very smaller local chieftains come up, Palegars and others, who take different geographical areas and try to establish themselves as regional powers. During this time, we see increased frequency of smaller, simpler hero stones coming up. So the reason was because everybody was fighting with each other to establish or to expand their power, political and military power. And the people who were fighting these wars, they were coming from the lowest strata. The soldiers who were coming, they were basically farmers and others who were forced to get into these kind of fights. So when they were dying, the family was able to afford these kind of stones only. And we see a lot of hero stones. Some villages have more than 50, 60 hero stones. So that talks about that particular area where we have this huge number of hero stones coming up. That means that area was during particular time, 16th, 17th century, was the place where this border struggle or power struggle was very highly intensified, and that is why the people who were dying or casualty is higher in number, which is reflected through these hero stones. So these simpler stones increase in frequency due to the unstable political nature of the region during that particular period in Karnataka as well as Andhra Pradesh. Okay, so the appearance may relate to an expansion of claims to the warrior hero stones it is, and they had very few economic resources as compared to rich people in the early phases who were creating bigger and more standardized and stylized hero stones. Okay, so this is some examples, as I said, this one. So these are like more stylized, more grand hero stones. First example, which you are seeing, it is from Government Museum, Bangalore. So this is a Veeramasti stone divided into two sections. Okay, sun is this side, moon is visible here. The symbol is represented here. It is divided into two sections. One section shows the hero who is going to the war. Okay, and as you can see, the umbrella is there, indicating the royal status or high allied status of the hero. And here you have the wife who has committed sati with both hands raised, one hand holding a citrus fruit, one hand holding a mirror, and this fan kind of hairstyle is there. Bird is represented, and these are her attenders. Okay, attenders, because as you can see, both all the three women, their hands are folded down. Their hands are not raised up. That means they are not the wives. You can look at their hairstyle. Their hairstyle is much simpler as compared to the main figure. Okay, so she is the one who has committed sati. She is the one who belongs to a higher status, as you can see from the scale of her size. In the all the women figure, she is the largest representation. That means in all the women figure, she has the highest status. Okay, and then you have the attenders who are just following her and making her prepared for the act of sati. Okay, now when we come to this side, this is again a hero stone where two heroes are represented. Why I have taken this again from our university campus? So here you have cattle which are represented. So cattle rates are simple ones also, cattle rates are complicated ones also. But in this case, what we have here is basically two heroes who have died. I have taken this example because this is one of the very clear, stylized, very fixed pattern of hero stone where three panels are there. The lowest panel represents the incident which led to the death of the heroes. The middle panel represents the two heroes being taken to the heaven by the Apsaras in the palanquin, and the topmost shows two heroes on the either side of the Shivlinga. That is, they have reached the heaven. Okay, so why I have taken this is because I want to show you that how the artist has very successfully, very beautifully, very aesthetically created these images as compared to very simpler ones which I have shown you earlier. Okay, so there very beautifully you can see these animals, cattle who are standing behind the heroes who are fighting to protect them. Okay, now one simple example which I want to talk, I will not go in detail because time is almost coming to the end. When my topic is because memorial stone. So in Jainism, there is a unique type of memorial stone which is called as Nishidi stones. Okay, so Nishidi stones I'm not going to talk here because that becomes a separate topic itself. So Nishidi stones are usually memorial stones which were created uh, in memory of the Jaina people who used to commit the act of Salekhana, that is starving oneself to death in fulfillment of a vow or something. One of the most famous examples of Salekhana comes from Chandragupta Maurya, who had supposedly came from Patliputra to Shravan Belgola, and he had committed that act. Okay, so the Salekhana ceremony was performed both by men and women in equal numbers, and either they would fast or they will just uh, take some kind of action to kill themselves or self sacrifice their life. And plenty of such inscriptions we can see in the Shravan region. And a 12th, 13th century inscription, which is there in the famous Meguti temple, which has the Ehole inscription of Pulkeshi. Okay, that is from Ehole. There is a memorial stone in that temple complex. And it is a Nishidi stone, which is talking about the erection of the Nishidi stone by um, the family members of Rami Shetty, who was the merchant trading community. Okay, and he belonged to a certain Jaina sect that is mentioned there. So why I have mentioned here this part is, see, in modern times, uh, most of the Jaina followers belong to trading community all over India. They are Marwari people who have come from Rajasthan, Gujarat, and they are the ones who are following the Jaina religion. So it is something which is not a new thing. Even in the 12th, 13th century, we see the same tradition where the trading community people are following the Jaina religion. So that is why I wanted to mention this particular example. Now, coming to the end part of this discussion, when we look at the significance of the study, why this is important. So, memorial stones may be considered as one of the principal sources or one of the primary sources for providing information on the socio-political as well as religious framework of the subaltern history of the region. Okay, I'm using the word subaltern here. Why? Because you all are familiar with the notion of subaltern. Our traditional history follows the allied kings and others. But when we look at these hero stones, some of the heroes have no names. They are probably farmers, or they are probably laborers, or they are probably just uh, soldiers. Okay, so they are the ones who are representing the subaltern population of that region of that particular early medieval or late medieval period. And this gives us a very interesting account of the local populace, the subaltern populace, and what kind of life and what kind of social cultural aspects was existing during that timeline based on these stones. And an interpretation of a visual representation as a mode of um, equality or reinforcement of position and class. Okay, because not everybody was committing sati. If they were committing sati, they were thinking of a higher position or getting a prestige. So this is something which is again reinforcing the idea that this act or this identity will bring you some kind of position or give you some kind of increased class. And the influence of the tradition of this act, either erecting the stone or committing sati, it is something which filters through from top to bottom. Because elites were performing, so the lower strata people started to imitate and follow up the same traditions and adapted the same practices to attain the same prestige. Okay. So the monuments like memorial stones are saturated with multiple horizon of meaning. We can't look at them from one single perspective, in which any one of the several meanings may enable us or limit us in thinking and acting about what kind of ideas were discussed or what kind of developments were happening during that particular period through space, time, as well as socio-economic circumstances. Okay. Now we come to the conclusion part of it. Sorry. So these records throw light on the economic aid and the grants which these hero stones or memorial stones mention, and the heroes were receiving from the authority, as well as the social prestige and reputation they were gaining by the act of sacrifice. The nature and extent of these grants and awards are interesting. Details of the socio-economic status of the benefactor as well as the recipient, who is giving the things and who is receiving the things. That both aspects are very interestingly analyzed in these stones. A functional interpretation can be made regarding these memorial stones by studying the relation between the place chosen for the erection and the routes of movement. Okay. In recent times, one concept you must have heard is landscape archaeology or settlement archaeology, because my basic subject background is archaeology. So landscape archaeology or settlement archaeology in the sense is because most of the things, most of the boundaries which we live in today, they are modern, created in modern times. So say when I say I'm in Tumkur, so Tumkur's boundary, whether it's a city or taluk or a district, everything has been created in last 40, 50, 60 years. And it is not a static thing. It has been modified, changed several times. So when we look at a village 30 years, 100 years, 300 years, or 500 years ago, how do we understand that the population who was residing in that particular settlement, I will not call it a village, okay, I will call it a settlement, because we don't know whether 500 years ago that place was still a village or something else. So how those settlements, they were located, how they were placed in connection to other settlements in other villages, how people were moving from one point to another point, and this route of movement, either for trade or for agricultural activity or for animal grazing activity or for social or ritualistic activities, this human movement and the location of these memorial stones. So how they are interconnected, because we have to remember memorial stones were placed in a point where people can see it, people can notice it. Okay. So it helps us in understanding if the locations were selected on the basis of eco-geographical niche to define a boundary that between utilitarian and symbolic space. That is, this space is related to private things, and this is related to more symbolic ritualistic space. And we can understand the cultural and natural setting of that particular time period. Okay, so that is something which is a very interesting aspect of hero stones, and scholars who want to do further studies in that, they can look into this kind of idea. Okay, so I have shared the bibliography of whatever papers, the topics I have discussed for anybody who is interested for the future reference. So with this, I